A man in his late 50s hears 4 bars of a song he has not chosen in decades, and something in his chest unclenches before he understands why. The relief has nothing to do with the melody. It has to do with the 12 seconds in which the present tense disappears. He does not reach backward because the past was better. He reaches backward because the present refuses to slow down long enough to be understood. This happens without him naming it. He calls it a good song, a good memory, a good year. He does not call it a retreat. The retreat is the part that stays hidden, because naming it would turn a comfort into a diagnosis, and he has spent 40 years avoiding that word for himself. You recognize the gesture even if you have never performed it in front of anyone. A particular decade, a particular object, a particular sound. Return to again and again, not for pleasure exactly, but for stability. The return itself has become the point. He keeps certain artifacts closer than their usefulness explains. A cassette player that no longer has cassettes worth playing. A jacket 2 sizes too small, kept anyway. A brand of car, a brand of beer, a brand of masculinity that stopped being manufactured around the same time he stopped being asked what he wanted. These objects do not function as memory. They function as anchoring points, fixed coordinates in a field that otherwise keeps shifting under him. The frequency with which he returns to them is not sentimental, it is regulatory. Something in his nervous system has learned that revisiting the old coordinate lowers the internal noise, even briefly, even without solving anything. You notice this pattern is rarely dramatic. It shows up in small refusals. Refusing the new interface until forced. Referring to a former job title long after leaving it. Explaining, unprompted, how something used to be done, as though the explanation itself were a form of standing on solid ground. None of this looks like distress from the outside. It looks like preference, even stubbornness, and he would describe it that way himself if asked. But preference does not usually require this much repetition. Repetition at this frequency is not about taste, it is about maintaining a floor. Individual temperament cannot fully account for a floor this specific, shared by so many men who never met each other, shaped by decades they did not choose to live through in this particular order. The pattern is too uniform to be personality alone. It has the shape of something learned collectively under conditions that applied to an entire cohort at once, which means the explanation has to move outward before it can move any deeper. He entered adulthood on the promise of a stable trajectory, one employer, one set of skills, one identity that would be assembled once and then simply occupied for the remainder of a working life. That promise did not survive intact. Industries restructured underneath men who had already committed their 20s to them. Skills that took a decade to build became obsolete inside a single product cycle. The trajectory he was told to expect and the trajectory he actually lived diverged sharply enough that the difference itself became a private, unspoken injury, one he was given no vocabulary to describe because the vocabulary available to him was built for talking about achievement, not about disorientation.
Technology accelerated the gap. He learned competence in one operating logic and then watched that logic get replaced repeatedly by systems built for people who had never known the earlier version at all. Each replacement was framed publicly as progress, which made any private sense of loss look like resistance to progress, which made the loss even harder to admit out loud. Competence, once a stable possession, became something that had to be renewed constantly, on terms he did not set and often did not fully understand. A man who had built his self-worth on being capable found himself, again and again, mildly incapable in small, humiliating increments that never added up to a single crisis but accumulated into something quieter and more corrosive. Labor itself changed shape around him. Loyalty to an employer, once treated as a virtue with a guaranteed return, stopped generating the security it was supposed to generate. He watched decades of dedication get absorbed into a restructuring memo. He learned, later than he would have liked, that the contract he believed he had signed with the working world was informal, unspoken, and entirely unenforceable. That lesson did not arrive as a single event. It arrived as a slow erosion of trust in every institution that had once organized his sense of what a stable life looked like. The emotional culture he was raised inside offered him almost nothing to metabolize any of this. Masculinity, as it was modeled to him, treated visible strain as a private failure rather than a shared condition. He was taught to solve, provide, and withstand, not to name what withstanding cost him. Therapy was for other people, or for later, or for problems more serious than his own. So the strain did not disappear, it simply stopped being spoken about, which is not the same thing as stopping. Social responsibility compounded on top of all of this. He became, often simultaneously, provider, decision-maker, and the person others assumed was fine because he had always presented as fine. Nobody checked. The checking had never been built into the role. He absorbed the responsibility of steadiness for everyone around him while receiving almost none of that steadiness in return. And the imbalance became so ordinary that it stopped registering as an imbalance at all. None of these conditions operated alone. Economic instability made emotional withholding feel necessary. Emotional withholding made technological disorientation feel unspeakable. Technological disorientation made institutional distrust feel personal rather than structural. Each layer reinforced the next, until what looked like one man's private habit of looking backward was actually the visible tip of several overlapping systems of adaptation running at once, mostly out of view even to him. Seen this way, the retreat into nostalgia is not one mechanism, it is a structure with depth, and the structure becomes visible only by moving through it, layer by layer, the way an investigation moves rather than the way a summary moves. The surface layer is what anyone standing nearby can see. He plays the old songs. He re-watches the same films from decades ago instead of anything current. He brings up a particular year, a particular team, a particular product line with a specificity that outweighs the conversation's actual demands. You have seen this in a father, an older colleague, a man at a gathering who steers every topic back toward a decade that ended before some of the people listening were born. What makes this pattern repeat with such consistency across so many men who share nothing else in common? A behavior repeated this reliably is not random. It is being reinforced by something underneath it that is not yet visible from the surface. Underneath the visible behavior sits a regulatory mechanism. Revisiting the familiar produces a measurable drop in psychological tension, the same way a fixed reference point lowers uncertainty in any unstable system. He is not indulging a preference, he is regulating an internal state using external material because the internal tools for regulation were never built. The old song, the old brand, the old story function as a kind of homeostat, something reached for automatically whenever the present becomes too undifferentiated to metabolize in real time.
What happens to a regulatory mechanism that gets used this consistently for this many years without ever being named as regulation? It stops being a response and starts being infrastructure. What began as an occasional retreat under specific stress becomes a default operating mode, triggered by smaller and smaller amounts of unfamiliarity. The threshold for needing the anchor gets lower every year it goes unexamined. He no longer notices himself reaching for it, the way a habit becomes invisible exactly at the point it becomes indispensable. What disappeared in the process of this accumulation, so slowly that no single year would show the loss? His tolerance for genuine novelty. Not intelligence, not capacity, but the specific willingness to sit inside not knowing without immediately reaching for the familiar to study himself. That willingness, if it was ever fully present, has been quietly traded away in exchange for 2 decades of manageable comfort. The cost was never visible in any single moment, because no single moment of reaching for the familiar looks like a loss. It looks like a preference, a harmless one, right up until the accumulation is total. This is not the final layer. The narrowing of tolerance for the unfamiliar is itself the entry point into something structural, because a man whose comfort depends on the familiar has to organize an identity around defending it. Identity is where the mechanism stops being a behavior and starts being a self. At some point, the habit of retreating into the familiar stops functioning as a tool he uses and starts functioning as a description of who he is. He introduces himself, implicitly, through his reference points. The music he listened to, the era he came of age in, the version of the world he still privately measures the current one against. You notice this in how quickly he can be offended on behalf of a decade he no longer lives in, as though a criticism of that era were a criticism of him directly. What allows a set of external reference points to become fused with a man's sense of self so completely that a threat to one feels like a threat to the other? Identity fuses with whatever regulates the nervous system for long enough, without knowing whether that thing was chosen deliberately. He did not decide at any single point to build his identity around a particular decade. He simply kept returning to it for regulation until the returning became indistinguishable from being himself. The self, in this sense, is not fixed. It accretes around whatever repeatedly proves reliable, the way sediment accretes around whatever remains still long enough in moving water. What disappeared once identity became this fused with the familiar past? The possibility of updating without it registering a self-erasure. A man whose identity is built on a fixed reference point cannot revise that reference point without experiencing the revision as a kind of death. This is why the resistance to change so often looks disproportionate to the change itself. It is not really about the new interface, the new terminology, the new social norm. It is about what agreeing to any of it would require him to relinquish about who he has already decided he is. This is not the final layer either, because an identity this fused with the past cannot simply exist quietly. It has to justify itself, and the justification arrives dressed as responsibility. Responsibility becomes the socially acceptable language for defending an identity that can no longer explain itself directly. He does not say he is afraid of becoming irrelevant. He says someone has to maintain standards. He does not say the new way threatens his sense of competence. He says the new way is undisciplined or shallow or a departure from how things are properly done. Responsibility, in his mouth, functions less as an ethical stance and more as a protective structure, one that lets him hold his position without ever having to name what the position is actually protecting. What sustains a definition of responsibility this rigid, held onto this tightly, for this long? It sustains itself, because responsibility was never separated for him from worth. He was taught early that being needed and being valuable were the same fact, so any narrowing of what he is needed for reads internally as a narrowing of what he is worth. Defending the old standard, the old method, the old hierarchy is not really about the standard. It is about preventing a recalculation of his own value that he has no framework for surviving. What disappeared underneath this fusion of responsibility and worth? The ability to be wrong without it threatening his entire position. A man who cannot separate his usefulness from his identity cannot afford to concede ground on anything that feels connected to either. So disagreements calcify into standoffs, and flexibility starts to feel, physiologically, like danger rather than like a normal cost of living among other people. This is not the final layer either, because a man defending his worth this rigidly cannot do it in isolation. Relationships absorb the structure next, and they absorb it structurally rather than emotionally. A partner learns which decades are safe to discuss and which topics trigger a defense that has nothing to do with the actual conversation. Adult children learn to soften new ideas before presenting them, packaging change in enough familiar language that it doesn't register as a threat. Colleagues learn to route around him rather than through him on anything that touches the reference points he has fused his identity to. None of this is announced. It is simply absorbed, the way a household absorbs a load-bearing wall it has learned never to remove. What does it cost the people around him to maintain this kind of accommodation indefinitely, without it ever being acknowledged as accommodation? It costs them the possibility of a fully honest relationship with him, because honesty in this configuration has to be filtered first through what his defended identity can tolerate. The people closest to him become skilled at management rather than connection, anticipating his reactions instead of simply relating to him, and over enough years, that skill becomes the relationship's dominant texture.
He rarely notices this shift, because from where he stands, things still feel mostly fine, mostly stable, mostly respectful. What has disappeared from these relationships, so gradually that its absence produces no single alarming moment? Spontaneity, mostly. The unguarded exchange, the disagreement voiced without careful packaging, the version of intimacy that does not require managing another person's fragility first. What remains is functional, often warm, frequently loving, but structured around a defense rather than around mutual exposure. This is not the final layer, because a man surrounded by this much careful management eventually has to answer, at least privately, what all of it has been organized in service of. Meaning is where the structure finally states its purpose out loud, even if only to itself. He begins to measure a life not by what expanded, but by what was successfully protected. Did the marriage survive? Did the job hold? Did the values he was raised with make it through intact, largely unrevised, to the other side of a world that tried repeatedly to revise them? This is not philosophy in any abstract sense. It is an internal audit, running quietly, that treats preservation as the primary evidence of a life well lived. What allows preservation, specifically, to become the dominant measure of meaning for a man shaped by these particular decades? Preservation becomes meaningful precisely because so much around him was not preserved. The job stability his father may have had, the institutional trust that structured earlier decades, the sense that competence, once earned, would remain valid indefinitely, all of it eroded within his own lifetime, on a timeline he lived through personally rather than read about historically. In that context, holding something steady is not a small accomplishment. It is the accomplishment, the one that organizes all the others underneath it. What disappeared as this became his central measure of a life well lived? Room for a second definition of meaning, one built on growth rather than defense. A life organized around what was successfully protected has very little architecture left over for what might still be discovered. Curiosity, when it appears at all, gets rerouted quickly back toward the familiar, because unfamiliar meaning-making feels, structurally, like risking the very thing the entire system has been built to preserve. This is not the final layer, because a pattern this specific, repeated across an entire generation of men, cannot remain private indefinitely. The deepest layer is collective, And it is collective precisely because no one built it deliberately and almost no one recognizes it as shared. Millions of men absorbed comparable economic instability, comparable technological disorientation, comparable emotional training that discouraged them from naming any of it while it was happening. Each one experienced the resulting defense as personal, as a private quirk, a specific taste, a specific stubbornness that belonged uniquely to him. None of them compared notes, because comparing notes would have required a vocabulary none of them were given. What allows an entire generation to build the same psychological structure independently, without coordination, without even recognizing the structure as shared? A shared environment produces shared adaptations reliably, even among people who never speak to one another about it. The economic conditions were structural, not personal. The technological disruption was structural, not personal. The emotional training that suppressed the vocabulary for any of it was cultural, transmitted broadly, absorbed identically across a generation that had no reason to suspect their private coping was actually a collective pattern with a traceable cause. What remains hidden, even now, even in an analysis this thorough, is the fact that naming the structure does not dissolve it. He still reaches for the old song. He still measures his life by what he protected. The mechanism does not require ignorance to keep operating. It only requires that the reaching continue to feel private. Looking back across all of it, no single layer explains the whole. The visible behavior only makes sense once the regulatory mechanism underneath it is visible. The regulatory mechanism only makes sense once its accumulation into infrastructure is visible. The infrastructure only makes sense once identity has fused around it, and identity only makes sense once responsibility has been recruited to defend it, and the reorganized relationships only make sense once meaning itself has been redefined around preservation. And preservation only makes sense against the backdrop of a generation that lived through the same structural instability at the same time, largely alone, mostly in silence. Each layer sustains the one beside it. None of them functions as an isolated cause. The system holds together precisely because it is a system, not a symptom. One observation remains, and it is not a conclusion. The man who reaches for the old song tonight will still reach for it tomorrow, regardless of how clearly the structure underneath the gesture has now been mapped. He is not required to change. He does not need to be corrected. He is, at this point, simply visible, in a way he was not visible a short while ago. And visibility is not the same thing as resolution. What felt, at the start of this, like a small private habit, turns out to belong to a structure much larger than any single man built or chose. That recognition does not close the subject, it only clarifies what the subject actually was. There is another pattern nearby, one this investigation has not yet opened. It concerns what happens to the same generation of men when the reference points they have defended for decades begin finally to be forgotten by everyone younger than them. Not attacked, not replaced, simply forgotten, without anyone bothering to argue the point at all. That pattern remains unexamined for now. He is still not fully understood. Neither is the shape this particular grief takes when there is no longer even an argument left to have. Thank you for following this investigation all the way through. If one of these 7 layers felt closer to home than the others, it is worth noticing which one and why. For those who want to keep tracing patterns like this one, staying subscribed means the next investigation arrives without having to go looking for it.